The officer was 23 years old and 6 weeks out of the academy, and he had his hand on his holster before the man he had stopped had finished turning around. It was 6:08 p.m. on a Friday in September, and the intersection of Maple and 5th in downtown Estabrook, South Carolina, was the kind of place where the day's last light came in low and amber between the buildings, and the pavement held the heat of the afternoon long after the sun had moved. There was a farmer's market vendor 2 blocks north packing down his table. There was a woman walking a dog on the far side of the street who had slowed without stopping. There were 4 other pedestrians within 30 feet who all, at the same moment, found reasons to look somewhere else. The man who had been stopped was standing on the sidewalk in front of the Estabrook Civic Building, holding a set of keys and a soft leather briefcase that was the color of dark walnut. He was wearing a gray suit, white shirt, no tie. He had been walking toward the parking lot adjacent to the Civic Building when the officer had stepped off the curb behind him and said, loud enough for the 2 blocks to hear it, "Hey, stop right there." The officer said there had been a report. He said there was a description. He said the man matched it. He said, "I need you on your knees. Hands behind your head." The man did not kneel. He stood where he was, both feet on the pavement, keys still in his right hand, briefcase still in his left. He looked at the officer the way you look at something you have looked at many times before and have decided, a long time ago, how you are going to face it. What happened next, the officer was not prepared for. His name was Tobena Achebe. He was 61 years old, 6 feet even, and had the bearing of a man who had been standing in front of rooms his entire adult life, and had learned, over 4 decades, exactly what that required. He was not a large man, but he took up the space he occupied with a completeness that had nothing to do with size. His hair was gray at the temples and close-cropped on the sides, and he had a habit, that when he was listening carefully to something, of going very still, not frozen, not tense, but the particular stillness of a person who is taking in everything and deciding what it means before they respond. He smelled of cedar and the faint residue of the black Bic pen he kept in his inside breast pocket, and had kept in that pocket for 22 years, since the afternoon in 2003, when he had signed the document that had changed the next decade of his life, and had looked down afterward at the ink on his fingers, and thought, this is what it looks like when something is permanent. He wore his father's cufflinks. They were small, oval, gold, with an inlaid pattern that his father had explained to him once. The Adinkra symbol for strength through struggle, which his father had chosen not because he was a sentimental man, but because he was a precise one, and the symbol was precisely what he meant. Emmanuel Achebe had worn those cufflinks to every important meeting for 31 years, to the offices of men who had told him no, and to the offices of men who had eventually told him yes, and he had left them to his son in an envelope on the kitchen table in a house in Columbia, South Carolina, on a Tuesday morning in 2001, 2 weeks before he died of a heart attack at the age of 73. Tobena had put them on the next morning and had not taken them off for anything that mattered since. He had grown up in Columbia, the only child of Emmanuel Achebe and a woman named Chidinma, who had taught mathematics at Richland Northeast High School for 37 years, and who had a habit of explaining complex things with a patience that never ran out and a precision that never softened. She had taught him that numbers do not lie, that the difference between a correct proof and an incorrect one is not interpretation but construction, and that the only acceptable response to being told something is impossible is to find the gap in the reasoning. She had lived long enough to see him win his first election. She had died in the spring of the year he was re-elected for the 3rd time, and he had delivered the eulogy in a church in Columbia on a Saturday in April wearing the gray suit that he had worn the day he was first sworn in, and the cufflinks, and a grief that he did not name out loud but that everyone in the room could see in the specific way he stood at the lectern, as if the ground beneath him had changed and he was deciding in real time whether it would hold. He had been a state senator for South Carolina for 16 years. Before that, he had been a county commissioner for 6. Before that, he had been a civil rights attorney for 14 years, with a firm in Columbia that had handled, in those 14 years, 231 cases, of which he had won 188. The ones he had not won he kept in a separate cabinet in his office, organized by year, because losing is information too. He had been in the Estabrook Civic Building that Friday for a constituent meeting, the third in a series he had requested himself, not through staff because the issue involved a zoning decision that was affecting 11 families in a neighborhood that had been overlooked by 2 successive administrations, and he had decided that the only way to move the thing was to put his body in the room. The meeting had run 40 minutes longer than scheduled because the families had things to say, and he had sat and listened to all of them. He had taken notes in the margin of the briefing document in the same black Bic pen he had been using since 2003. He had walked out of the Civic Building at 6:04 p.m. He had been 4 minutes from his car. Officer Dexter Nwosu Bright was 6 weeks out of the academy and had been assigned to the Estabrook Patrol Division at the beginning of September. He was 23 years old, 5'11", and had the particular energy of someone who had wanted this job since he was 15 years old and had been in it for long enough to feel the weight of the uniform, but not yet long enough to understand the weight of the judgment. He had been briefed that morning about a vehicle break-in on the west side of downtown. The description from the report was a black male, approximately 6 feet, gray clothing. He had called it in on the radio before he approached. That part he had done correctly. What he had not done was look at the briefcase. What he had not done was look at the way the man was standing. What he had not done was look at the cufflinks, which were visible at the end of both sleeves in the amber September light, small and gold, and carrying a weight that had nothing to do with their size. He had seen a tall black man in gray clothing walking toward a parking lot. He had made a decision in 4 seconds. He had his hand on his holster and was telling the man to kneel before he had completed the thought that had generated the instruction. The man did not kneel. He stood where he was, both feet flat on the pavement, keys in one hand, briefcase in the other, and looked at Officer Nwosu Bright the way a man looks at something he has encountered enough times that he knows exactly what is inside it. Not with fear, not with contempt, with a specific kind of clarity that is only available to people who have already decided, years before this particular moment, what they are and what they will not do. 3 feet to his right, a man in a green canvas apron, one of the farmers' market vendors who had not yet finished breaking down his table, had turned and was watching. He had his phone in his hand. He did not raise it. He was waiting to see what came next. Tobena Achebe set the briefcase down on the pavement beside his right foot. He set it down carefully, the way you set down something that cost you more than money. Then he reached into the inside breast pocket of his gray suit jacket, slowly, with both motions visible and deliberate. Because he had been in enough of these situations to know that the speed of your hands in the next 12 seconds was information the person in front of you was reading very carefully. He took out the black Bic pen and set it on top of the briefcase. Then he reached in again and took out his credential wallet. He opened it. He held it at the level of Officer Nwosu Bright's eyes, at a distance of 3 feet, so that there was no question about what was being presented and no excuse for misreading it. The credential was a state senate identification card bearing his photograph, taken 2 years ago, slightly more gray at the temples than he was now, his full name, his district number, and the gold seal of the state of South Carolina. Officer Nwosu Bright read it. He read it again. The amber light was still coming in between the buildings. The woman with the dog on the far side of the street had stopped walking now. The man in the green apron had not lowered his phone. The 4 pedestrians who had found reasons to look away were looking back. Nwosu Bright's hand came off his holster. It came off slowly, the way a hand comes off something when the muscles that were holding it there have just received new instructions from the brain and are still processing the update. His arm dropped to his side. His mouth opened slightly, closed. The specific expression of a person who has made a public bet on the wrong outcome and is now standing in front of the evidence. Tobena Achebe had been in that silence before. He let it exist for 3 full seconds, not to punish, because 3 seconds was the right amount of time for what had happened to register in the bodies of everyone watching. Then he said quietly, "I am Senator Tobena Achebe. I represent the 4th District of South Carolina. I have been a resident of this state for 61 years. He paused. I was walking to my car. If you can feel where this is going, and I think you can, subscribe right now, because what Senator Achebe does with the next 24 hours is the part that changes more than this one street corner. and I need you here for all of it." The patrol supervisor arrived at 6:19 p.m. His name was Sergeant Emmanuel Ndukwe, 44 years old, 15 years on the Esterbrook force. A compact man with a gray-streaked mustache who drove to the intersection of Maple and 5th with the controlled quiet of someone who had been called to enough of these situations to know exactly what he would find, and who had never, in 15 years, found a way to feel neutral about finding it. But he arrived at 6:19 p.m. The credential presentation had happened at 6:11. That was 8 minutes. In those 8 minutes, Officer Dexter Nwosu Bright had not left. He had taken one step back when his hand came off the holster, and he had stood there at a distance of approximately 6 feet, reading the credential card for the third time and the fourth, and doing something that was not quite thinking and not quite stopping, the particular suspension of a person who is committed to a course of action, and found the course blocked, and has not yet identified a different route. Tobena Achebe had not moved from the spot where he was standing. He had not raised his voice. He had not called anyone. He had not asked a question. He stood on the pavement with the credential wallet open in his left hand and his right hand loose at his side, and let the 8 minutes do what 8 minutes does in a situation like that, which is accumulate. The woman with the dog on the far side of the street had stopped walking and was standing still now, her dog sitting obediently beside her, both of them looking at the two men on the sidewalk. A bus went past on 5th Avenue, its diesel engine loud and then gone. And in the silence after it, the corner was very quiet. The light had shifted slightly in the 8 minutes, amber deepening toward orange, the long shadows on the pavement longer now. The whole intersection held in the particular quality of September light that makes everything look like it is being observed rather than simply lit. Kolade, the man in the green canvas apron, had been recording for 6 of those 8 minutes. He had his phone at waist height and slightly angled, and he had not moved his feet or spoken since he had pressed the button. He was a man who had been selling produce at this intersection every Friday for 4 years, which meant he had seen things at this intersection, and he had decided at some point that the phone was the most useful thing he could do with his hands, and that he would not lower it until the situation had resolved in one direction or the other. Officer Nwosu Bright looked up from the credential card for the 5th time and said, "I'm going to need to call my supervisor." Tobena Achebe said, "Yes, you are." That was the exchange. 3 words, then 6, then the radio. Sergeant Ndukwe's car turned onto Maple at 6:18 p.m. and parked at the curb at 6:19. He got out of the car. He looked at Nwosu Bright. He looked at the man standing on the sidewalk with the credential wallet open in his hand. The recognition was immediate. Sergeant Ndukwe had been in the Civic Building 2 months ago for a community policing forum that Senator Achebe had organized himself and had attended without staff, and he had sat 2 rows from the front and listened to the senator ask the kind of questions that told you the person asking had read every piece of documentation available. Before they walked in the room, he had spoken with him briefly afterward about a drainage issue affecting the 6th Street neighborhood, which the senator had known the specific details of without being prompted, because he had looked them up before he came. He walked to where the senator was standing. He did not look at Nwosu Bright again. He said, "Senator Achebe, I am deeply sorry for this." 6 words. He said them the way a person says something that is inadequate to the situation, and knows it and says it anyway because saying nothing is worse. The senator closed the credential wallet. He put it back in the inside pocket of the jacket, next to the pen. He looked at Sergeant Ndukwe for a moment with the stillness that was his particular form of appraisal, reading the room, filing what he found. He said, "What is your officer's name and badge number?" Ndukwe gave it. The senator took out the pen. He wrote it in the margin of the briefing document he had been carrying inside the briefcase. On the same page where he had written notes about 11 families and a zoning decision that 2 administrations had overlooked, in the same black ink that had been in the same pen since 2003. He wrote the name and the badge number in the same careful, fast print hand he used for everything that he intended to use later. Then he picked up the briefcase. He said good evening to Sergeant Ndukwe. He looked once at Officer Nwosu Bright, not with threat, not with contempt, with the specific leveling attention of a man who has decided that you are worth remembering, and then he walked to his car. He was home by 7:12 p.m. He ate dinner with his daughter, who was 15, and who asked him why he was quiet. And he said he had had a long day. She said his days were always long. He agreed that this was true. He asked her about her homework. She told him about a history assignment involving the civil rights movement, and he listened. And at the point where she described a photograph of 4 men being refused service at a lunch counter and said, "I don't understand why they just sat there and took it," he said. They were not taking it. They were recording it. They were making it part of the record. She thought about that for a moment. She wrote something in the margin of her notebook. That was Friday. By 9 a.m. on Monday, 3 things had happened. The first was that Tobena Achebe had filed a formal complaint with the Estherbrook Police Department's Office of Professional Standards, a 4-paragraph document that was specific, factual, and contained no emotional language whatsoever. It cited the time, the location, the officer's name and badge number, the nature of the demand, the absence of any reasonable basis for the stop, and the particular detail that the officer had his hand on his holster before Tobena had completed turning around. The complaint was received at 8:17 a.m. The Office of Professional Standards notified the chief at 8:31. The second was that the man in the green canvas apron, whose name was Kalade, who sold sweet potatoes and okra from a farm 12 miles outside Estherbrook, and who had been standing at that intersection every Friday for 4 years, had posted a video on his phone. He had begun recording at the moment Senator Achebe set down the briefcase and reached into his jacket. The video was 47 seconds long. It showed the credential presentation, the officer's hand leaving the holster, and the 30 seconds that followed. It did not show everything that had come before, but it showed enough. By Sunday evening it had been viewed 212,000 times. The third was that Senator Achebe had placed a call on Saturday morning to the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, a woman named Willa May Nwosu Boateng, who had been in the legislature for 19 years, and who had been trying, for 6 of those years, to advance a bill that would require uniform standards for pedestrian stops across all law enforcement agencies in South Carolina. A bill that had died in committee twice, and that had been waiting for the particular moment when the argument could not be dismissed. He told her what had happened on the corner of Maple and 5th. He told her in 3 minutes because he had spent the drive home on Friday, composing the version that said the essential thing without any excess. He said, "This is the moment." She said, "Send me the complaint document." He sent it at 9:43 a.m. The bill was reintroduced to committee on the 2nd Thursday of October. It passed out of committee on the 1st Wednesday of November, 17-4. The full Senate voted on it 4 weeks before the end of the legislative session, and it passed 31-9. The governor signed it on a Tuesday morning. The signing ceremony was held in the Capitol building in Columbia, and Senator Achebe was in the front row, wearing the gray suit and the gold cufflinks with the Adinkra symbol his father had chosen because he was a precise man, and the symbol was precisely what he meant. Officer Dexter Nwosu Bright was placed on administrative leave for 30 days pending review, returned to active duty with a formal reprimand in his file, and a mandatory 18-month supervision program developed specifically for officers in their first year. The program was designed by a panel that included 2 senior officers, a community liaison, and a retired judge, and its central requirement was simple. Before drawing a weapon or issuing a compliance command in a non-emergency situation, an officer must complete a visual and verbal identification of the subject and the basis for the stop. The panel named the program after its founding principle. They called it the full stop, meaning a complete picture, not a partial one, before any action is taken. The first cohort of officers to complete it was 12 people. 6 were in their first year. 4 were veterans with more than 10 years on the force. 1 was Sergeant Ndukwe, who had requested to be included, though it was not required of him, because he had decided that standing in a room where something was taught was different from standing in a room where something had already happened, and he preferred the first. 1 was Claude, the sweet potato farmer, who had submitted a written application to join the Community Advisory Council that oversaw the program's implementation. His application had included 4 sentences and a single question: who decides what a threat looks like? The council accepted him on the first vote. A 23-year-old officer saw a tall man in gray, and made a decision in 4 seconds that he could not undo. What he had not seen, what 4 seconds does not leave room to see, was 61 years of standing upright in rooms that had not expected him. The father's cufflinks, the mother's precision. 231 cases, organized by year, including the ones that were lost. 16 years of showing up to a legislative chamber that had not been built with his arrival in mind, and building something inside it anyway, because that is what you do with a room, when the only alternative is to leave it to the people who are already there. There are things that cannot be put on their knees, not by a demand, not by a hand on a holster, not by 4 seconds of judgment on a street corner in September. The things that take a lifetime to build have a mass that no single moment can overcome. You can stop a man on a sidewalk. You can demand compliance. You can make a public bet in front of witnesses. But you cannot reach into a person and remove what they have spent 61 years constructing. You cannot unknow a grief. You cannot unstitch a cufflink. You cannot take the pen from the inside pocket or the briefing document with the margin notes or the vote count that was already in motion before anyone arrived at the corner of Maple and Fifth. The bill passed. The program ran. The farmer joined the council, and Tobena Achebe drove to the Capitol on a Tuesday morning and sat in the front row and watched the governor sign the document that his father's cufflinks had been present for, in their own way, since long before it was written. The question I want to leave you with is this. You were on that corner. Not Tobena, not the officer. You were one of the 4 pedestrians who found a reason to look away. You were there. You saw it happen. If a man in the green apron had not lifted his phone, and no video existed, and no complaint had been filed, what would you have done with what you saw? And if the answer is nothing, what would it have taken to make the answer something? Leave your answer in the comments. I really want to read it. Subscribe for more stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people the world overlooks until they change everything. I'll see you in the next one.